My name is Hazel. Wait, no. Let me start with what matters. I'm 63 years old. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and 2 years ago, I woke up in the back of an ambulance with my son-in-law's voice in my ear, rehearsing a lie. That's where this story ends up. But to understand how I got there, you need to know how it began. And it began the way all the worst things do, quietly, with a smile. I'd been a school librarian for 31 years, retired at 60, took my pension, started my little vegetable garden, started reading all the books I'd been recommending to other people for 3 decades. I had my daughter living 40 minutes away in Selkirk. I had my 2 grandchildren. I had my Tuesday coffee group at the community center. I thought, honestly, that the hard part of my life was behind me. My daughter met him at a work conference in Ottawa. She called me that night, practically breathless. "Mum, I met someone. He's so kind. He actually listens when I talk. You know how rare that is." I did know. Her first marriage had been difficult, not violent, just cold and indifferent in that particular way that hollows a person out slowly. So when she described a man who brought her tea without being asked, who remembered the name of her childhood dog from a story she'd mentioned once, who called when he said he'd call, I was happy for her. Genuinely happy. They were together for 8 months before he moved to Winnipeg to be with her. I met him for the first time over dinner at my place. I'd made a roast. He brought wine and a small pot of honey from a local apiary near his hometown in New Brunswick, said he remembered my daughter mentioning I took honey in my tea. I thought, well, this man pays attention. He was 44 then, quiet in a way that seemed thoughtful rather than withdrawn, handsome enough, salt and pepper at the temples. He worked in procurement for a large construction company, traveled a fair bit, earned well. He asked about my garden. He asked about my years at the library. He looked me in the eye when I spoke. They married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony, just family and close friends at a little venue outside the city. My daughter wore her grandmother's earrings and cried during the vows, the good kind of crying. I stood beside her and thought, this is right. This feels right. I should have trusted the small thing that bothered me that day. Just one small thing. When the photographer asked my daughter to turn slightly to the left, her husband put his hand on her arm. Not gently, not guiding. He gripped. Just for a second. She adjusted immediately, didn't even seem to notice. I filed it away somewhere I wouldn't find again for a long time. The first real sign came about 4 months after the wedding. My daughter called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. She knew Tuesdays were my coffee group nights. Her voice was strange, flat. She said she just wanted to check in. Nothing was wrong. How was I? I asked what was going on, and she said, "Oh, nothing. My husband just thought I'd been spending a lot of time on the phone lately." I laughed a little. I said, "Well, you're talking to your mother, not running off to Las Vegas." She laughed too, but the sound was thin. I want you to understand something. When I look back now, I can see the shape of what was happening. But at the time, each individual thing seemed explainable. A comment here. A canceled plan there. My daughter becoming gradually quieter. Less likely to suggest getting together. More likely to let my calls go to voicemail and text back an hour later with a reason she couldn't talk. He was never rude to me. That's the thing people don't expect when I tell this story. He was never cold or dismissive to my face. He'd come to family dinners and compliment the food and help clear the table. He'd ask about my health, my garden, whether my knee was still bothering me. But slowly, carefully, the visits became less frequent. My daughter stopped coming to Tuesday coffee. She stopped bringing the grandchildren to my place on Saturday mornings the way she used to. When I asked why, she always had a reason. He had something planned. The kids were tired. She wasn't feeling well. About a year into the marriage, I drove to her house unannounced. I know that's not always the right thing to do. But I hadn't seen her in 3 weeks and she'd canceled our last 2 plans, and I had this feeling sitting in my chest that I couldn't name. She answered the door looking like she hadn't slept properly in a month. Thin. There were shadows under her eyes. She seemed startled to see me, then looked over her shoulder before she let me in. He wasn't home. He was traveling for work, but she looked over her shoulder anyway. We had tea at her kitchen table. She told me everything was fine. She told me she'd just been tired. I looked at my daughter, my child, who I had known for 40 years, and I said, "Please tell me what's happening." She cried. That's when she first told me. Not about hitting. Not then. Just the words. The way he spoke to her when they were alone. How nothing she did was ever right. How he criticized how she loaded the dishwasher, how she spoke to her colleagues, how she styled her hair, how he'd told her she was lucky he put up with her because most men wouldn't bother with a woman who'd already had a failed marriage. How when she tried to talk about her feelings, he'd say she was too emotional, too sensitive, always making things about herself. I reached across the table and held her hands, and I said, "This is not normal. This is not how a husband speaks to his wife." She pulled her hands back. She said he was under a lot of stress. She said she probably was too sensitive sometimes. She said he'd grown up in a household where people were blunt and she just needed to adjust to his communication style. She said, and I will never forget this, she said, "Mom, please don't make it into something it isn't." I drove home that night and I sat in my kitchen for a long time in the dark. Over the following months, I tried to stay close. I called, I texted, I dropped off food when I knew he was traveling. I took the grandchildren for sleepovers to give her a break. Each time I saw her, she was a little more faded, a little more careful about what she said. She started pre-explaining things before she told me anything. He had a long week at work. He doesn't sleep well when it rains. I know it sounds strange, but you don't understand his background. Then one evening, she called me very late. It was past 11. She was whispering. She told me he'd grabbed her wrist that evening and twisted it. Not hard enough to break anything, she said quickly, as though that qualifier was meant to reassure me. It was an argument about money. She'd spent $300 at Canadian Tire on supplies to fix the back fence without asking him first, even though it was her money from her own account, her salary, her name on the statement. He'd seen the charge and followed her from room to room, getting louder and louder. And then he grabbed her wrist and told her she had no right to make financial decisions without discussing them with him first. I told her to pack a bag. I told her to bring the children and come to my house right now. I would make up the beds. She said no. She said he'd apologized already. She said it wouldn't happen again. I barely slept that night. But what could I do? She was a grown woman. She had a life, a home, children who were in school nearby. I couldn't drag her out. I couldn't make her leave. All I could do was stay close enough that she knew the door was always open. What I didn't know, what she didn't tell me until much later, was that by then, things had already been physical more than once. The wrist was not the first time. There had been other times, things she'd covered with long sleeves with foundation. She'd become expert at it. She told me that when you're in it, you develop this strange instinct for minimizing for yourself as much as for anyone else. You sort events into boxes. The box marked, "It wasn't that bad." The box marked, "I provoked it." The box marked, "It only happened once." It only happened twice. It only happened that one time when he was really under pressure. I think about her alone in that house sorting things into boxes and I can barely stand it. 18 months into the marriage, he began having problems at work. A contract fell through. Some kind of internal dispute with his company's Edmonton office. He started coming home in a state I can only describe as coiled, tight, and silent in a way that my daughter learned to read immediately, the way you learn to read weather. She'd text me sometimes, "Bad night?" or just, "Staying quiet tonight." I understood what those messages meant. The financial control got worse during this period. He moved her salary into a joint account she didn't have a card for. He said it made more sense to consolidate, that they should be building together, not separately. He gave her a weekly amount for groceries and household expenses. She had to account for every dollar. She told me she once spent $8 at Shoppers Drug Mart on a birthday card for her friend and hid the receipt because she knew he'd ask why she was spending money on someone outside the family. I want you to think about that. My daughter, who had a master's degree, who had run the finances of a 20-person nonprofit for 6 years, who had bought her own condo at 29, hiding an $8 receipt from her husband. I started documenting things on my end, dates, and what she told me. I kept a notes file on my phone. I don't know exactly why. Some instinct, some librarian's habit of recording, some part of me that knew. Eventually, someone might need to know the timeline. The night everything broke open was a Wednesday in February. I'd spoken to my daughter at noon that day. She'd sounded all right, a little distracted, but she mentioned the grandchildren had been at each other all morning and she was looking forward to the afternoon quiet. I told her I was making borscht if she wanted to bring the kids for dinner. She said maybe she'd see what her husband's plans were when he got home. He got home early. She told me later that she could hear it the moment his car pulled into the driveway, the way he shut the door, that particular hard click. She knew. She didn't know what had set it off. She never did, really, at that point. The reason was always something, but also always nothing. That evening, it was that she'd called the school about something to do with their son's reading assessment without mentioning it to him first. The school had called him at work, some standard administrative thing, both parents on the contact list, and he hadn't known what they were talking about. He felt embarrassed, he said. Blindsided. Made to look like he didn't know what was happening in his own family. She tried to explain. He stopped listening. His voice got to that low, flat register she'd learned to fear more than shouting. He hit her across the face, then he grabbed her by the shoulders and threw her against the kitchen counter. She went down and hit the floor, and her head struck the edge of the cabinet door that was hanging open. She heard something, she told me, a sound she couldn't quite describe except to say it felt like it came from inside her skull. She blacked out. When she came to, she was on the couch. He was crouched in front of her, and his face, she said his face was completely different from the one she'd been looking at 5 minutes earlier. Panicked. His hands were shaking. He kept saying her name and asking if she could hear him, and the first thing she thought, before the pain hit, before she was fully conscious of what had happened, was that he was afraid, not of her, for himself. He told her she had to go to the hospital. He'd say she slipped on the back step. It had been icy. There'd been freezing rain that morning. It was plausible. She was too dazed to argue. She asked about the children and he said they were upstairs. They hadn't seen anything. He'd call his sister to come over. She told me she lay in the back seat of his truck on the way to the Health Sciences Center and listened to him on the phone with his sister, and then listened to him talking to himself, quietly, working through the story. Backstep. Freezing rain. Came inside to tell me. She was already on the floor. I called 911. I didn't know what to do. He said it over and over, smoothing out the edges. She said she thought about me. She said she thought, my mother is going to get a phone call tonight and I don't know what I want her to do. At the HSC, he played the part beautifully. I say this now with a cold clarity I didn't have then. The frantic husband, the voice that shook just the right amount, the hand that reached for hers. She was admitted quickly, given the head injury. Concussion, they suspected. Possible worse. They took her for scans. He had to wait. The nurse who stayed with her during the CT prep was a woman about my daughter's age. My daughter told me later that this woman didn't say anything for a long time, just checked things calmly and professionally. Then, when they were alone in the corridor for a moment, she said, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Did you fall? My daughter said nothing. The nurse waited. Then my daughter started to cry. Not the careful, controlled crying she'd gotten so good at, but the kind that comes from somewhere deeper, that you have no warning about and can't stop. The nurse held her hand. That was all. She just held her hand. The scans showed a moderate concussion and a small bleed, nothing requiring surgery, but serious enough to require monitoring. The emergency physician came in with the results and asked my son-in-law to step out. He resisted. Hospital policy, the doctor said in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Security was nearby. My daughter realized later that the nurse had already spoken to someone before the scan. The moment the door closed, my daughter said the first true sentence she'd said out loud to anyone in 2 years. She said, "My husband did this to me." I didn't know any of this was happening. I was at home. My phone rang at 9:30, and it was an unknown number, and when I answered, it was a woman from the hospital's social work team saying my daughter had been admitted and was asking for me. I drove to the HSC and whether I should not have been driving in. I don't remember the drive. I remember parking and running across the icy lot, and I remember the automatic doors and the smell of the emergency department, that particular antiseptic cold air smell. And then I remember a nurse leading me down a corridor and opening a door and seeing my daughter in that bed, her face, the side of it, and I had to hold on to the door frame. She reached for me and I went to her and I held her the way I had when she was small and frightened, when she was 3 years old and had bad dreams, and she shook against me, and I couldn't speak. He was in the family waiting room. I knew that because the social worker told me when she met with us, gently and clearly, the way people are trained to explain things that need to land without shattering. She told me what my daughter had disclosed. She told me that a report had been made to the Winnipeg Police Service. She told me that my son-in-law had been asked to leave the premises and had not complied initially, but that security had managed the situation. I asked where my grandchildren were. She said they were still with his sister, and that child welfare had been contacted as a precaution, standard protocol in these situations. She said it without judgment, just information, and I was grateful for that. My daughter gave her statement to the police that night. A constable, a woman who looked younger than I expected, but who asked her questions in a steady, unhurried way that I thought was exactly right. I sat beside my daughter. I held her hand. She talked for almost 2 hours. The officer told us afterward that he had been found in the hospital parking lot. He hadn't actually left, which told me everything I needed to know about whether he respected any boundary unless forced to. He was arrested on the spot. Assault causing bodily harm. The weeks that followed were the most exhausting of my life, and I say that as a woman who has buried a husband and raised a child alone. There were applications for emergency custody orders, conversations with a family lawyer, careful navigation of the child welfare process. My daughter moved in with me with the children, just like that, one hospital bag and then a few boxes from the house when he was in custody, and then we figured out the rest. The legal process was long. Crown attorneys in Manitoba take domestic assault seriously, but the courts are slow. There were delays, adjournments, a period when bail was granted, and I will tell you honestly that I had a deadbolt installed on every door in my house, and I kept the porch light on all night. My daughter and I had a code, a specific text message she'd send if she ever felt unsafe when she was out. I checked my phone every hour. He contested everything. His lawyer, and he hired a very good one, tried to argue the injury was consistent with a fall. They tried to suggest my daughter was unstable, that the marriage had been troubled for reasons on both sides, that the children had been taken from their home by an overreacting grandmother who'd never liked her son-in-law. I sat in that courtroom and I listened to a man in an expensive suit suggest that I was the problem, and I kept my face very still. My daughter testified. She sat in that witness box for 3 hours over 2 days, and she answered every question with more composure than I could have managed. She told the truth. All of it, the things she'd never told me and the things she had. I watched the jury, 12 people from this city, ordinary people, and I watched them watch her, and I could see the moment the room shifted. The medical evidence was significant. The emergency physician testified about the injury pattern. The nurse testified about my daughter's condition and disclosure. The social worker testified. The cell record showed his location history in a string of messages sent to a friend 3 weeks before the assault that I will not repeat here, but that were submitted as evidence of his attitude toward his wife. He was found guilty. The sentencing took place on a Tuesday 4 months after the verdict. My daughter and I drove to the courthouse together, and I held her hand in the parking lot before we went in, the way she'd held mine at her father's funeral 17 years ago. We walked in together. She gave a victim impact statement. She'd worked on it with her counselor for weeks. Read it to me once at my kitchen table the week before, and I could not get through it without crying. Standing before the judge to read it, she did not cry once. Her voice was steady and clear, and I was so proud of her I could barely breathe. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in federal custody with a 10-year firearms prohibition, a no-contact order from my daughter and grandchildren that would remain in effect indefinitely, and mandatory completion of a domestic violence intervention program. She also awarded sole custody of the children to my daughter pending a full family court hearing. When they let him out, he looked at my daughter. She looked back. She did not look away. We sat in the car afterward for a long time without saying anything. The city moved around us the way cities do, indifferent and ordinary. A transit bus went past. Someone was scraping ice off a windshield, 2 spots over. Life just kept going. Eventually, my daughter said, "I want a coffee." So we went and got coffee. That was 14 months ago. My daughter is in her own apartment now. A nice one, 3rd floor, good deadbolts, 2 blocks from the school the children love. She's back at work, a new job. A smaller organization, but one where she says she feels like herself again. She's seeing a therapist every week. She does not talk about him unless she needs to for legal reasons. The grandchildren are their children. which means they're resilient and complicated and doing better than anyone had a right to hope. My grandson had some difficult months. My granddaughter drew pictures for a long time of houses with very large locks on the doors. Her therapist says this is normal, that it's how children process. The pictures have changed recently. Last week she drew our house, mine, with a garden and a cat in the window. Even though I don't have a cat, I put it on the fridge. I still see my daughter twice a week, Tuesday and Sunday. We don't always talk about any of this. Sometimes we just have tea and watch something on television, and I listen to my grandchildren arguing about whose turn it is to pick the show, and it feels almost ordinary, which is the most extraordinary thing I can imagine. I want to say something to you if you're watching this and something in what I've described sounds familiar. You may not be the one being hurt. You may be the mother, the sister, the friend who is watching someone you love disappear in increments, who is getting the late-night whispered phone calls, who is trying to figure out the right thing to say, the right moment to push. There is no perfect moment. There is no sentence that will make someone leave before they're ready. I know how maddening that is. I know the helplessness of it. But staying close matters more than you know. Being the person she knows she can call, the door she knows is always open, the voice that says, "I believe you and I'm here." That matters. My daughter told me later that the reason she let herself tell the truth that night at the hospital was because she knew, in whatever foggy, half-conscious place she was in, that I would come, that I wouldn't ask why she hadn't left sooner, that I wouldn't be disappointed in her. Be that person. However long it takes, be that person. And if it is you, if you're the one making excuses, covering bruises, hiding receipts, listening to someone practice lies in the front seat of a car, please know that what's happening to you is not your fault. Not the staying, not the leaving and going back, not any of it. The shame that keeps you silent is something he put in you. It doesn't belong to you. In Canada, the Assaulted Women's Helpline is available around the clock at 1-866-863-6511. You can also text if calling isn't safe. Shelter movers can help you leave safely. Victim services through your local police can explain what a protection order actually does and how quickly it can be granted. I'm 63 years old, and I have learned things in the past 2 years that I would have given almost anything not to know. But I have also watched my daughter come back to herself, slowly, the way light comes back in March when you've stopped believing it ever will. Small at first, then undeniable. She laughed, really laughed, last Sunday at something my grandson said, threw her head back the way she used to. I watched it happen and I didn't say a word. I just let it be there. That's everything. That's what I wanted to tell you. There's a moment I keep coming back to, my daughter lying in the back seat of his truck on a February night, listening to him rehearse a story that wasn't true and thinking of me. Not calling out to him. Not fighting back, just holding on to the thought that I would come. That's what I think about when people ask me how this ended the way it did. It didn't end because of a dramatic confrontation or a single brave decision. It ended because over years of slow, quiet damage, one small thread stayed intact, the knowledge that someone was still there, waiting, with the light on. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what allows a person to do what he did. Not the rage. I understand rage. It's an ugly, ordinary human thing. What I mean is the calculation. The way he took a frightened, unconscious woman, and before he'd even checked whether she was breathing properly, he was already building the story. The back step. The freezing rain. The concerned husband. That kind of cruelty doesn't come from losing control. It comes from a person who has decided, somewhere underneath everything, that another human being exists mainly to serve his needs, and that protecting himself from consequences matters more than her pain. That's not a moment of weakness. That's a failure of character that ran through every year of their marriage like a crack through a wall. And yet my daughter stayed. For 2 years she stayed, and I have heard people say, kind people, well-meaning people, that they don't understand why. I want to say this as plainly as I can. She stayed because he was methodical about dismantling her ability to trust her own judgment. He did it slowly enough that each step seemed survivable. He hid the $8 receipt. She hid the receipt from herself first. That's what that kind of control does. It turns a person's own mind against them. Walking away requires believing you deserve better, and he spent 2 years making sure she didn't. What changed her was not one thing but the accumulation of small acts by people who refused to look away. A nurse who held her hand in a hospital corridor, a social worker who explained her options without rushing her, an officer who asked questions in a steady, unhurried way. Me, sitting beside her and saying nothing except I'm here. None of us did anything heroic. We just stayed present and kept telling the truth. What I know now, watching my daughter rebuild, watching her laugh on a Sunday afternoon with her head thrown back the way she used to, is that the qualities that got her through this weren't given to her by anyone else. They were already hers. The integrity to finally say the truth out loud in that hospital room, knowing what it would cost. The clarity to see, once the fog began to lift, exactly what had been done to her and to name it without flinching. The endurance to get up every morning in a new apartment in a strange city of her own making and put one foot in front of the other, and then do it again the next day and the one after that. Those things were in her all along. He almost convinced her they weren't. That's the thing I'll never quite forgive. Not the violence, as terrible as it was, but the years spent trying to make her small enough to need him. She isn't small. She never was.